Great. Well, welcome everyone. It is really, really special to get to be with you today on Earth Day, which of course, Earth Day is every day for those of us that understand the importance of our relationship to the natural world and reminding ourselves that we are part of that natural world. So, being together in family and community is a real gift. And first, I'll start off by welcoming all of you to this webinar. And again, if you'll use the chat feature to introduce yourself, your organization, your location, that helps us get to know who you are. And we will be using the chat throughout the hour to have comments, questions, communications. That's going to serve us best with this group today. So I will start by introducing myself. My name is Susanna Tuttle. I use she, her pronouns, and I work at the North Carolina Council of Churches. I've been with the organization for 15 years now, so it's an honor to serve in this capacity as a faith leader and a person of faith and conscience. And this webinar is being hosted by my program area that I help direct called the Eco Justice Connection. And I'm going to drop into the chat for you just a very quick overview of what the Eco Justice Connection is and hope that you will visit our website. It's ejc.ncchurches.org. And when you go through our different program areas, you'll recognize that North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light serves as our energy justice and energy democracy issue area. And it has been in that capacity since even before I started working here for over 20 years. So when you get a chance to take a look at some of the initiatives that we've been involved in, many of you might be familiar with the Interfaith Power and Light National Network. There's a lot of changes going on across the country in a lot of different aspects. And so as we can continue to commit ourselves to eco-justice and energy democracy here in North Carolina, we're evolving our program into that larger scope of the eco-justice connection. So appreciate people joining, putting your names in the chat, your locations, your organizations. We'll continue that as we get started. So again, I'm looking forward. Tim's going to introduce himself. It's a really exciting opportunity for me to have one of my friends and dear colleagues join us here today on Earth Day for this super important conversation. And so I'll let him introduce himself when he starts his presentation. And he does have his slide deck, which is great. Tons of great resources and information that he's going to share. And then we're going to have a dialogue between Tim and myself. Some of you know me well, some of you are just meeting me, but I love conversation. I love community. And as a faith-based organizer, this really is about leading with love. I like to talk a little bit about each time we launch a campaign or talk about the issue areas that we care most about as we work to protect the people and places that we love. Really, everything that we do is a What I Love campaign. What do you love, and what is it that you're willing to do to protect it? So, in thinking about kicking off this webinar today with all of you in community here on Earth Day 2025, I would like to start by reading the Eco Justice Connections JEDI statement, our justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion statement that we are committed to through and through. And it is listed on our website. If you go to our website on About Us, there's a link right there. And so I'm going to share that with you. And if you would like to see it as a kind of prayer, that's great. If you don't identify with any religious or spiritual practice, that's great that you're here too. There's all ways to be in the world. We all have different constitutions within ourselves and our relationship to the natural world. And I believe that we believe in what we believe in. And so just the fact that you're joining us here for this conversation shows that you do care about the people and planet. And so I will open with our JEDI statement. So the North Carolina Council of Churches Eco Justice Connection, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Statement. Eco Justice Connection, or as we refer to it as EJC, is actively working to become an anti-racist program of the North Carolina Council of Churches. We believe that relationships must be centered in justice and equity within the human family, as well as with all the natural world. We strive together towards the sacred goal. We bear this responsibility with integrity, insisting our network that we do what is just, even when the path is not obvious or easy. As advocates for climate justice, we commit to self-transformation by actively working against systemic racism and anti-Blackness, ending both the historic disenfranchisement of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and racially rooted economic and health disparities, and dismantling structures of racial and economic marginalization and colonialism. We also will uphold tribal sovereignty and counteract dynamics of erasure of tribal nations in our government decision-making processes. Our diverse religions and spiritual traditions call us to work for systemic change and a more just society that embraces differences based on religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, and physical ability. EJC will address this with specific, often updated commitments regarding internal processes, policy positions, diversity efforts, training, funding mechanisms, and more. EJC works to reverse paradigms of oppression of human and the natural world as we build a thriving, inclusive, and equitable future on behalf of all who inhabit this good earth. We commit to providing practical resources that can be shared across communities, directly relating how faith can and should affect climate and environmental justice action, and how to build a culture that is both spiritually and physically resilient so that even as the earth changes, communities of faith are able to thrive and help others. So again, that is our eco-justice statement. I appreciate you listening to it. I appreciate you recognizing how challenging it is to live into those principles each and every day. And so I recognize again that this is an inclusive space, and as it maybe not some of you, this might be the first time that you've actually joined a faith-led topical discussion around this issue. So super glad you're here. Again, we're leading with love and compassion. Please be compassionate and considerate in your comments and questions in the chat. And I'm going to bring in my dear friend and colleague, Tim Judson. Hi, Tim.
Hey,
Super excited about
Susanna.
this conversation. I'm going to hand this over to you now. So yeah, and I'll come back in once you're done with your formal presentation.
Okay,
Thanks.
well, yeah, and thank you so much for having me and creating this great way to spend Earth Day with y'all.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay, see you soon.
so hey everybody. So as Susan mentioned, my name is Tim Judson, and in my position, I'm the Executive Director of an organization called the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, which is a national environmental organization that was founded in 1978 to be sort of a national resource and networking center for grassroots organizations and communities that were concerned about issues with nuclear power and wanting to build a sustainable energy future. And so we're still doing that work today, and working with also within the climate movement to accelerate a just transition to 100% renewable energy future. Um, Now, myself, I actually am based and live on Onondaga Nation land in a place called Syracuse, New York, and which is about 30 miles from three nuclear reactors.
Hold on one moment, please, okay?
Great. And that's how I come to this work. And I've been working on watchdogging those nuclear power plants and working on energy issues for about 27 years now. And came to NIRS, to work on the national level from that grassroots perspective, rooted in community. And one of the things that I've really loved about getting involved in the broader national climate movement, and in particular with folks in the Southeast, is the approach that y'all in the Southeast bring to these issues in terms of love of place and love of community, and rooting the work that y'all are doing in that. And that's really the perspective that I came to this work with when I started doing it, and have done it ever since. Um, So, but Susanna asked me to give a presentation today on nuclear power and its and why it's being promoted as a solution to the climate crisis, and especially this whole sort of topic, this sort of buzzword that we're hearing in North Carolina and nationally around what they call advanced nuclear, and kind of digging into what that is and what and what it really means for our energy and climate future. Um, so with that, I'm going to dive in, and I'll start with some good news, which is that we have solutions at hand, and just renewable energy has been growing by leaps and bounds, both around the world and here in the U.S. In the last 2 years alone, we've seen renewable wind and solar grow by over 1,000 gigawatts, 1 million megawatts of new capacity from solar and wind coming online in just the last 2 years. And for perspective, that's basically 3 times as much as the total amount of nuclear generation capacity in the world. And that's in new solar and wind just in the last 2 years, tripling the amount of electricity generation that we have worldwide in nuclear power. In the US, the story is similar. We've expanded renewables, mainly wind and solar, by over 75 million megawatts just in the last, or 75,000 megawatts just in the last 2 years. And that's a trajectory that's been increasing. You see that chart here on the bottom right, where the growth of renewable energy is really skyrocketing. And part of that's because of a huge success story, which is that because, as we've been expanding renewable energy in the US and around the world, it's become more and more affordable, to where, even today with the inflation problem that we've had the last couple of years, wind and solar are still the least expensive sources of electricity that we can put on the grid. And that contrasts with nuclear, which has become even more expensive over the same amount of time in the last 16 years. And just as a most recent example of that, we have the 2 new reactors that were just brought online in Georgia at a cost of $37 billion and over 17 years to plan and construct. And that has hit Georgia ratepayers with 24% increases in their electricity rates just to pay for that project. But we do have a problem facing renewables, which is that even with that dramatic rate of growth relative to everything else, it's not growing fast enough. And we have a climate crisis that we need to address. And we have huge backlogs of renewable energy, solar, wind, and storage primarily around the country that are waiting to come online, waiting for approvals to access the grid. This isn't, just, getting approval to, for siting in communities. This is getting permission from the utility companies to connect wind and solar and storage to the grid. Nationally, that's more than 2.5 million megawatts, 2,500 gigawatts of wind and solar and storage that are stuck in these what they call interconnection queues. And regionally, we see that playing out as well. In the largest electricity market in the country called PJM, which kind of stretches from the Northeast into the Midwest, 250 gigawatts of wind and solar and storage waiting for approval. In California, more than 500 gigawatts. And in the Southeast, smaller, only 120 gigawatts waiting for approval. And that's probably because the utilities are really undershooting in the Southeast in terms of how much wind and solar and storage they're planning for, which is the other problem. But to kind of bring us to where we are with nuclear, we have an established nuclear industry in the U.S. It's existed for over 60 years. We also have, basically the oldest fleet of nuclear power plants in the world, averaging more than 40 years old, which is what they were, the reactors were designed to operate for originally. More than half are over 40 years old, and we have an increasing number that are even over 50 years old, pushing 60. And we have a bunch of nuclear power plants that are having their operating licenses extended out to 80 years. including most recently the 3 Oconee reactors in South Carolina. Now, so almost all these reactors are old because when we built most of them in the 80s, 70s and 80s and 90s, they became super expensive. Massive cost overruns on most of the projects, averaging over 300% of their original budgets, some as much as 10 times what they were proposed, and massive delays in construction, out to an average of 14 years to build one of these reactors. So we stopped building them basically because utilities were buried in debt from building them, and rates had been skyrocketing in the 1980s to pay for it all. And so that led to basically a cessation of nuclear plant construction in the 1990s, and didn't pick up again at all until the last 15 years, and that was a total bust as well. The nuclear industry saw this problem coming, where all of their reactors were getting old, and they weren't building any to replace them. And so they declared a nuclear renaissance about 20 years ago. And the federal government, under President Bush, passed energy legislation that for the first time provided large subsidies for nuclear power plants. Including loan guarantees, which are basically forgivable loans. If the project were to go bust, the loans would be forgiven. Production tax credits, basically tax rebates for generating electricity from nuclear power plants. And then a couple of a demonstration plant that never got built, and then some other subsidies as well. As a result of all that, there was a bonanza. There were 30 new reactors proposed between 2006 and 2008. 14 of them actually got licenses issued by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but only 4 even began construction. And those were the 2 reactors in Georgia and 2 more in South Carolina. Before those reactors were even 5 years into construction, they bankrupted Westinghouse, the largest nuclear corporation in the world. And the summer reactors were canceled because the utilities just couldn't swallow the debt. And Vogtle 3 and 4 were finally completed in 2024. 7 years late in construction, over $36 billion in cost. And that meant that the nuclear renaissance had a 93% cancellation rate. So all that time and effort spent to promote these reactors resulted in basically nothing. It's been a similar story worldwide. You see the same kind of bubble in the 70s and 80s into the 90s with reactor construction that basically tapered off and ended. And except for the reactors that have been built in China in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a significant net decrease in nuclear power worldwide. And for many of the same reasons, that the cost has just been extraordinary. The delays have really created problems. And the delays in construction have created problems, and there are just other things. There are better sources of energy for meeting our needs. So that brings us to today, in this talk about advanced nuclear. And first question you might ask is, what is it? And the reality is there is no consistent definition of what advanced nuclear is, but it refers broadly to a number of types of nuclear reactors. All of them, produce electricity the same way. They use nuclear chain reactions to generate a ton of heat. That's used to boil water, and the boiled water turns turbines to generate electricity. On that end, it's the same as operating a coal plant or a gas plant, but the way that the heat is produced is very different. And so, these advanced reactor types include other kinds of large light water reactors. Light water is just regular water that we're familiar with, like the new reactors that were built in Georgia are also sometimes called advanced reactors, the Westinghouse AP1000s. There are what are referred to as small modular reactors. Some of those also use light water would use light water to generate electricity. Some of them use other types of coolants like helium or liquid sodium, which is a metallic flammable metal, or what they call molten salts, which are essentially salts that are used as the medium for directly cooling the nuclear fuel. There are other types of non-light water reactors that are small but not modular, and so there are a few of those that are being proposed around the country. And then what are called microreactors, which are even smaller than SMRs, generally in the range of 10 megawatts of capacity or less. And those are being proposed for a number of different applications, whether it's remote sites like oil drilling operations in the Arctic, or forward military bases, or even some of them for artificial intelligence data centers. The reality is, though, that none of these designs for new reactors have been approved yet. And this is despite more than 10, and in some cases, some of these companies have been working on their designs for over 15 years. They haven't gotten approved, any of them approved finally by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And these are some of the most well-known and sort of kind of more advanced in terms of their stage of development companies that are pushing these designs. There's NuScale, which is which was supposed to be the leader in small modular reactors, but it canceled its first project a year and a half ago because the cost had already become so extraordinary, even though they hadn't even begun construction yet. Natrium, which is a company founded by Bill Gates of Microsoft, that's working on getting a construction permit for a reactor that it wants to build in Wyoming. A company called X Energy, which is working with Dow Chemical on building a nuclear plant at one of Dow's chemical sites in Texas. A company called Kairos, which is building a demonstration reactor in Tennessee right now. Not an actual commercial power plant, but sort of a test of its design. And then a company called Oklo, which submitted a license application about 5 years ago to the NRC, but the NRC ultimately had to reject it because Oklo couldn't complete all the details of the design for the NRC to review. So for all of the talk about SMRs, there's one of the things that sort of drives me crazy a lot is that when you hear these things talked about in the media, they say SMRs do this or SMRs are that. In fact, they don't exist yet. And so to talk about them in the present tense is sort of perpetuating an illusion that these reactors are actually available to provide electricity in the US, and they're really not. So despite all of that, the costs of these new types of reactors are already becoming more expensive than the reactors that we have more experience with. And so what this chart shows is, on the left-hand side, the costs of the Vogtle reactor project in Georgia, which was initially in 2013 when they began construction, around $10,000 per kilowatt. By the time they completed it, it had doubled from there. But what we see with these different SMR designs, whether it's NuScale, X Energy, or a General Electric reactor that just got a permit in Canada, they're already more expensive before they've even begun construction than what the Vogtle project was when it began construction. And so the costs are only going to go up from there. That's really the experience that we have with nuclear energy projects. Now, there has been a lot of attention to this in the last few months because there have been a number of deals, announced with various big tech companies, from Microsoft and Amazon to Google and Facebook, as well as some others, announcing deals to either restart existing reactors that have already closed, or to build new reactors to power their data centers. And when you sort of go through the details of all these deals, there's actually not much there. Most of these are not actual contracts from the AI companies to buy electricity from nuclear power plants. Most of these are heavily contingent on the reactor designs being approved or getting licensing approvals from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which has never happened before, such as restarting closed nuclear reactors. or the eventual price for the power plants being affordable. And what I've heard repeatedly in going to some nuclear industry conferences over the last few months is that in order for any of this to happen, um, not only do the huge subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act need to be maintained, against the threats of the Trump administration, but in addition to those subsidies, all of these projects are going to require what the industry and the AI industry are calling cost overrun insurance. De-risking is what they're saying. But basically, for the government to pay the increased costs, the cost overruns that are likely to occur after they begin construction of them. So, for instance, with the Vogtle reactors in Georgia, those were supposed to cost $14 billion recently. I mean, originally when they were approved, they ended up costing $37 billion. So, essentially the industry is asking for the government to agree to pick up, that additional, $20 billion plus of costs that could have, that could happen with some of these other newer reactor projects. No other industry has ever said that its future was contingent on that. Now, there are also still similar types of risks to these new types of reactors, despite the fact that they're smaller. And in fact, a lot of these new designs are getting approvals by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to exempt them from requirements for the types of reactors that we're more familiar with. So, for instance, you might when you think of a nuclear plant, you might think of those big dome structures, the concrete and steel dome structures that cover the reactors that are called containment structures. They're there to try to prevent, releases of radiation in a meltdown scenario from escaping to the environment. These new reactors are largely going to get built without containment structures and without emergency planning requirements for evacuating the community or protecting people when there is a nuclear accident. And that's being justified on the basis that they're smaller, that they don't have as much radiation, within the reactors to be released. But in fact, what we know from the last 60 years of nuclear power plants around the world is that small reactors can still have large accidents. And we have examples of that, both here in the US, with the Santa Susana field lab meltdown near Los Angeles in 1959, the Fermi 1 reactor near Detroit that was famously turned into a book and later a song. As well as other reactors around the world. And many of these, the same types of designs that we're talking about now when we talk about advanced nuclear. In addition to that, even if there isn't, even if we get through without a nuclear accident, these reactors will produce more nuclear waste for the amount of electricity they generate. And that's just based on the physics of smaller reactors. There was a study put out by researchers at Stanford and the University of British Columbia a couple of years ago that found that these reactors will generate between 2 and 30 times more radioactive waste, than the current types of reactors that we have. And so what that means is that it'll amplify the environmental justice impacts that the nuclear industry already has. And we talk about this, in terms of the nuclear fuel chain or the uranium fuel chain. All of the nuclear power plants that we're talking about, and the ones that we already have, use uranium as their fuel. And the way that works is, uranium is a radioactive heavy metal, and it's one of the few. It has a couple of different isotopes that can create fission, a nuclear chain reaction. And so what they have to do is to mine uranium and then refine it to produce the ore. And then they have to enrich that to concentrate the what they call the fissile isotope, uranium-235, to a level that can sustain a nuclear chain reaction in a reactor. And that's what generates the heat, is the splitting of these uranium atoms that then creates a lot of other radioactive byproducts that then are also themselves really long lived in the environment. And so there's this whole sort of array of radioactive wastes that get produced through this process that we call the nuclear fuel chain. And so this is, an image of what the fuel chain looks like, from uranium mining all the way down to, to the disposal of nuclear waste at the end of the fuel cycle. On the front end, you have tremendous amounts of radioactive waste that are produced even before any fuel goes into a reactor. When you count from uranium mining and the milling and the enrichment of the uranium, it's more than 5,000 pounds of radioactive waste are produced for every pound of fuel that goes into a nuclear reactor. And then all of that fuel that goes into the reactor becomes radioactive waste itself. And it becomes, 100 million times more radioactive by the time they take it out than it was when it went in. And this affects communities across the country, but also in pockets. So most of the uranium mining in the country happens on indigenous lands or near indigenous lands. And we have, because of our bad environmental laws on uranium mining, or mining in general, there are over 15,000 abandoned uranium mines in the US. And again, most of these on indigenous lands. It's more abandoned uranium mines than we have McDonald's in the country. And then, and in the Southeast, we have a concentration of nuclear industries, around the fuel fabrication. So almost all of the fuel rods for nuclear reactors in the country are made in North Carolina and South Carolina by General Electric and Westinghouse. And those communities themselves get contaminated from the side effects, the side products of the fuel plants. Then on what they call the back end, we have the operation of the nuclear power plants, which generates a wide array of radioactive waste, some of which are released into the community, into local water bodies or the air. And some of it is shipped off site to other locations, like the Barnwell low-level waste dump in South Carolina, and similar sites in Texas and Utah and Washington. And then at the end of, when the nuclear plant is retired, through the process of decommissioning it, basically the entire facility becomes radioactive. It gets disposed of as radioactive waste because they become so contaminated over time. Decommissioning usually costs over $1 billion per reactor. And that is a cost that ends up being borne by ratepayers and taxpayers. And then at the end, what you see here at the bottom right is what's left over after that, which is the casks of irradiated nuclear fuel or high-level radioactive waste that don't have a home anymore. I mean, there's no permanent storage facility in the country. We're not working on one right now, and so all of this waste is staying at the reactor sites, basically in perpetuity right now. And in terms of talking about new reactors, there's also a cost issue to this, which is that, with the current reactors, the federal government committed to take responsibility for the waste and to ship it to a national repository starting in 1998. And because we failed to do that, the nuclear industry is suing the federal government every few years to get hundreds of millions of dollars in their costs for storing that waste repaid. But because the government now knows that there's no prospect of having a repository anytime soon, new reactors aren't going to have that same benefit. So all that waste that would be generated is going to be waiting around for a place to send it. And for all that time, the companies that own those reactors are going to have to pay for those costs. And that's ultimately probably going to get passed on to ratepayers as well. So this is me with a picture of my local nuke. But sort of, with a legend as to, where essentially, the harms to the community have been coming from, with the radiation releases, the leaks and spills, and where the radioactive waste is stored. And you can make a map like this, in my experience, from any nuclear power plant in the country. So, kind of bringing it back to Earth Day, we kind of always ask the question, can we nuke the climate, and do we actually need to? And we think it's important to remember, and I think Susanna for reading the Council of Churches Jedi statement from before, is that there's really serious environmental justice and human rights violations involved in this whole industry. And before we start talking about promoting nuclear power as a solution to the climate, if we don't need to do it, then should we? And that's where I'll wrap up the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I don't know about the rest of you. I think that there's a lot of really knowledgeable people about nuclear on this that I could see from the chat. And then there's people like myself that desperately need to learn more, which is why I wanted to host this conversation today, because this is a conversation that comes up. I mean, quite frankly, just walking down the street sometimes. I mean, and how many climate justice and climate action marches have I been involved in where nuclear just comes up as a conversation topic, as if it's something that any of us have been educated about, or given this presentation as an example. I'll admit a lot was in that deck that I could not repeat or even totally understand. So this is why we're here today. And the chat has been active, which is fantastic. Super excited about it. Before we started this webinar, Tim, I sent you a document. So if you can open that back up, then you can see, and I've bolded the questions and I've added the comments. So try not to miss anything in our great community conversation that we're having in the chat. And I'll continue to do that as you kind of work your way through and answering and commenting. If that's something, are you capable of doing
Sure.
that right now?
Is it in the chat or is it in my
It's
email?
in your, it's the Google Doc that I sent with the links for this webinar. So
Oh,
sent it.
got it. Yep.
Okay,
See
cool,
it.
cool, cool. As you scroll down, that's where I'm putting things. So the bold ones are in questions, and the others are comments. People have been sharing resources, which is great. And if you're on your phone or you're traveling and you're not looking at the screen or the chat, we will be sending a recording to everyone that registered to your email, and we'll include a PDF of Tim's slides as well, so that you can do a deep dive. And I know Tim and the team at NIRS, this is what you do each and every day. So whatever we're able to not get to today, you'll be able to contact Tim and further the conversation, and maybe have Tim come and present with your group, or however we want to move forward. So Tim,
It looks like I need access to the document. I just tried to.
oh, of course you do, because this is how, well, actually you are the editor, but I will just quickly, actually, I'm going to review this. And
You might have shared it to my NIRS address, and I don't have
I
access to it.
did, and here it is in Gmail. Gotta love that. So, yeah. So I'm gonna, hopefully you can open it now.
Got it.
Great. All right. So starting there at the top with Diane's, great. She shared a link from Citizens Climate Lobby about energy permitting reform. Michelle made a comment about how Oregon has removed nuclear in the 90s and why they need to be diligent to try to, block it from being brought back. And yeah, I'll just let you go through that as I continue to collect questions.
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of Michelle's comment, there were a bunch of states back in the 70s and 80s that actually put moratoriums on building new nuclear reactors in their states. And most of them because they realized that there was no solution to this nuclear waste that those sites were going to produce, and that it was going to put the state's environment at risk. As long as that was the case. And so what we're seeing now is that, with still no resolution to the nuclear waste problem, because of all the hype around nuclear energy that we're seeing today, there's a big push by the industry to repeal those moratoriums. And some of which are really democratic, like requiring in Oregon that there be a public referendum in order for a new nuclear plant to get a permit. Um, but there's a push in several states to repeal those moratoriums, and it's a big fight, in a big climate justice fight. Rao asks, does the US have the capacity to manufacture SMRs? And that's a really good question. The argument that's being made for small modular reactors is that they can get nuclear power to be affordable by mass production. So the idea is that like small modular reactors could be built in factories, standardized designs, like making cars or airplanes, and and get the cost down by mass manufacturing them. Trouble is that to do that, you've got to have hundreds of these things potentially on order to get built, and you've got to have a factory that's set up to do them. And there are no factories for SMRs in the country. And in fact, the industry is in a real conundrum about this because there's some recognition in the last year or two that they can't have dozens of SMRs on the market and achieve that kind of standardization and cost reduction. But nobody is prepared to choose which SMR is going to be the one to get built. So there's no factories to make them. And so what the industry is acknowledging, and that's why they're talking about cost overrun insurance, is that there are no factories to build SMRs, and they're going to be really expensive to make them, just like they have been for building the existing types of reactors we have.
That's actually, if I can just comment really quick, that's super interesting. Again, as a layperson, understanding the intricacy of not just the end generation, so production, but the building of it. And as someone who is more familiar with the renewable energy and the construction of where the solar comes from and the manufacturing that goes along, particularly with wind turbines and the conversation that's happening here in North Carolina and along our coasts. I don't, I guess I don't know that my brain has ever gone to where are these SMRs going to be manufactured? What does that look like? And thinking from an ecological cycle perspective, that cradle to cradle model of the fact that folks are just throwing these into integrated resource planning procedurals, and we're looking at the build out of infrastructure around, data centers and all of these different things. Like let's have a real conversation about the construction of what it is being proposed at that level. So thank you. That just
Yeah. Well, it's a serious issue, right? I mean, one of the like the reason why the reactors in Georgia initially were proposed, why they chose that Westinghouse design, is that it was also supposed to be modular manufacturing. Like even though it was a large reactor, Westinghouse had basically come up with a design that they said was going to be able to be manufactured in factories and then transported to the reactor sites and assembled. And so they sold it that way. But in the process of actually trying to build it, they bankrupted the manufacturers that were actually hired to build those reactors. And so now there is no factory to build the Westinghouse reactors anymore in the way that they were originally proposed. And it's the same, and so the same thing could happen with the SMRs as well. So let's see. Question from Peter. Slides show supposed construction costs, but do not show projected levelized cost of energy, dollars per kilowatt hour. How expensive would their energy produced be? That's a really good question, Peter. And on one of my slides, I showed the chart from Lazard, which is a financial company that provides an annual estimate of what do they call the levelized cost of energy, which is an unsubsidized estimate of what different energy sources cost to build. And nuclear energy they say nuclear energy has what they call an LCOE of $182 per megawatt hour, compared to $50 per megawatt hour for wind and $61 per megawatt hour for solar. Now, those are unsubsidized costs, so it doesn't count tax credits and anything else you can apply to it. But essentially, the new nuclear plants are more than 3 times as expensive, for the actual energy. in Georgia, it may even be more than that with the $30+ billion cost of those reactors. John asks about France. France generates 65% of their electricity from nuclear. What type of reactors are they using? Looks like a good resource of information. So France, traditionally has generated up to 75, even close to 80% of their electricity from nuclear plants. Those are basically the same types that we already have. They chose a more standardized design. They basically built the same reactor over and over again in France. But even there, they had cost overruns and delays that came up. And so they stopped building them by around 2000. But they've also been running into problems with these old reactors, which have resulted in extended shutdowns because they're finding cracks and rusting in the components and in the piping that are a serious nuclear safety issue. They're also having problems in France because of climate change. Most of the reactors in France are built on rivers, and as the climate's been getting warmer, the river water has become too warm for some months out of the year for these reactors to operate at full power. And so the percentage of electricity from nuclear in France has been declining in the last 10 or 15 years. And France is really kind of, stumped as to what to do about it. Waters are only getting warmer, and their reactors are only getting older. And the one new reactor that they've attempted to build has come in at more than 4 times the original cost and took almost 20 years to build. So they're just, it's not proving to be a good energy solution for them in this day and age. Naomi asks a similar question about Finland. Is there any data from Finland regarding their pursuit of advanced nuclear? Similar story actually is they just completed or brought online their first new reactor since the 1990s in Finland. Again, it was a French reactor design that was also 3 to 4 times above the original cost and took 20 years to build it. So the experience has not been good in Finland either. And so, it's a similar situation in country after country when you look at it that way. Let's see. Judith Klein asks, how can the media be encouraged to present this information to the public, both on radio and TV and also written media? That's a really good question. We're seeing a lot of industry public relations around the country. In the last 10 years, the nuclear industry has really, invested a ton of money into public relations. And so they've driven this narrative in the media about nuclear energy, which doesn't usually comply with the facts very well. And so what I would encourage people to do is to be writing letters to the editor, expressing your opinion about it. And when you see information that isn't accurate or reliable, to insist that the newspaper do a better job, or the media outlet do a better job of presenting a more balanced view on the issues.
Is it cool in that framework for us to send media to you? Like if we read an article that we know is untrue or something comes up even at the level of our utility commission and public service commissions, that we could guide them to NIRS's resources, and you'd be
Yeah, absolutely. I
in
mean,
the capacity to interact at that level?
yeah, and also, we also, are happy to, provide, everyone with talking points as well to write their own letters, to be their own
Great.
voice on this issue
Ooh,
as
I'd
well.
love to. Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Yeah. Let me see. So, Stephen asks, please clarify, you said 250 gigawatts waiting for approval, 120 gigawatts in the Southeast, 500 in California. Nuke plant provides 1 gigawatt. Yeah. So, these are, again, some of this is energy wonk sort of talk. We talk about a gigawatt. That's 1,000 megawatts of electricity. That's, usually about enough energy for 1 million homes is, one way you often hear it talked about. there's also a difference between megawatts of generation capacity, which is, how much power can a power plant produce in the moment versus the amount of, megawatt hours in a year, which is the total amount of electricity generated. Nuclear plants, have to run at full power almost all the time in order to remain economical, at least to the extent they can. And so they generally run at what are called like 90% of 90% of the time when they're running well. Renewable energy sources come in lower than that, between like, 15% for solar in the Northeast to like 45% for offshore wind. And so that's why the levelized cost of energy is helpful. When we talk about, $50 a megawatt hour for wind, that's the actual cost of the electricity. So it's still less than a third of what the cost of electricity from a new nuclear power plant is. And it's helpful to think of it that way. When I provided that slide at the start that showed that there's been over 1,100 gigawatts of renewables built around the world in just the last 2 years. That's effectively, when you factor those things I just described in, that's effectively as much actual annual electricity as the entire nuclear industry generates worldwide. That's new renewables just in 2 years, equal to the amount of nuclear electricity total around the world. Sudarshan, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. What is the policy of the present administration towards nuclear energy? Generally very favorable. In fact, the new Secretary of Energy comes out of the natural gas industry, but he also was serving on the board of one of these nuclear corporations before he took office. And has been expressing very strong support for nuclear. The national energy emergency declaration that the Trump issued in the first day in office includes uranium as an important domestic energy source. And so, what we saw in the first Trump administration was that they were equally supportive of nuclear as they were of fossil fuels. And I would expect the same to be true, of the current administration. Josh asks, how many people, if any, were harmed by the incidents and all those sticky notes on my poster of the, Fitzpatrick and 9 Mile Point nuclear reactors? It's part of the trouble is, when we talk about the effects of nuclear power plants on public health, is there's not been any credible national studies done. And so what we have, in reactor communities, where I've lived and worked, is the experience of the local public. So, around Oswego County, which is where the nuclear plants are near where I live, everyone knows there's high rates of cancer, but there's never been studies done to figure out why. But a couple of examples that I'll use to talk about it is that there was a study done of all nuclear power plants in Germany called the KIK study, K-I-K-K. You can look it up. And they found that study found that there was within 5 kilometers of basically every nuclear reactor in Germany, there was a significant increase in incidence of childhood leukemia. So that's kids getting cancer near every nuclear power plant in Germany. And in the US, there was a study done in Western Massachusetts near the Yankee Row reactor, where they found, and this was the community organized to get the state to do an actual public health study, from basically looking at the effect of radioactive waste releases from that reactor over 30 years. And they found that there was an epidemic of cancer and different diseases, a 10-fold increase in Down syndrome, epidemics in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, and other cancers. And that was just one small community. In a community that was rural and small enough that statistically you shouldn't have been able to find an epidemic of any disease, But the rates were so high that it actually showed that there was a lot of suffering going on in the community. And again, we see this happening in, communities with nuclear facilities and uranium mines around the country.
Tim, on that note, we're coming up on the hour, and I'm really, actually the health component, the impacts of nuclear, both generation, construction, the fuel rods, everything you've been talking about at the North Carolina Council of Churches. We do have a Partners in Health and Wholeness entire area that we work with people of faith and conscience across the state. And so I'm really, really, through the eco-justice connection, interested in the intersectionality of how we talk about this, not just from a climate justice perspective. Well, certainly the justice orientation around connecting the people to the problem and the people to the solutions is the point of our partnership here. And moving forward, I hope we can do another webinar. There are some additional questions. I appreciate all the comments. I am definitely feeling like there needs to be a part 2 to this. So if you're willing to come back and join us again, as maybe in the summer, we'll do a summer series. And I know I did put a comment into the chat letting folks know that for any questions that didn't get answered, they're just a handful, but that we can put together a shared email response with the recording, your slide deck, and any other questions. So feel free to continue to add questions. I'm going to close us out now so that folks that have to move on to the next thing in their day. Hopefully you'll get outside if you haven't already been outside. And I would really like to close out with a quote from Pope Francis, the encyclical letter Laudato Si, on care for our common home. So if you have to drop off, thank you for being here. And I will just close with these powerful words. So grateful for you, Tim, and all that you do, and look forward to our next time to doing this together.
Thanks, Susanna.
So in the words, dear Saint Francis, may he rest in peace. Yet all is not lost. Human beings, while capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves, choosing again what is good, and making a new start, despite their mental and social conditioning. We are able to take an honest look at ourselves, to acknowledge our deep dissatisfaction, and to embark on new paths to authentic freedom. No system can completely suppress our openness to what is good, true, and beautiful, or our God-given ability to respond to grace at work deep in our hearts. I appeal to everyone throughout the world not to forget this dignity which is ours. No one has the right to take it from us. So sharing those words from St. Francis, I just named him again, gave him sainthood. I think we all understand what it means to be an agent of change in this time. May we go forth and speak our truth to power. I'm going to drop that into the chat for everyone. And as we move forward together, not one step back, in the spirit of strength through unity, peace through justice. I hope everyone stays safe and strong, and happy Earth Day. Thanks again.